Hello there, welcome to Plus Talk on Plus Life, where we're all about turning positive into a plus. Today we're jumping across the pond to Brighton in the UK. We're talking to Matt Webster. Hey, Matt.
Hi, Carl. How's it going?
It's going very well, thanks for asking. Nice to see you. Let's just dive straight in. You're a man living with HIV. Something that struck me when I was preparing for this interview, I was reading something you had posted and you said, contracting HIV made me dismantle my own beliefs about being pos. Now I help others do the same. Walk me through that.
Yeah, so when I was first diagnosed in 2011, I basically knew nothing. I'd seen so back in the 80s, the government in the UK ran like an advert, which was basically like the word AIDS being chiseled onto a tombstone and then the tombstone falling over. And that was kind of like one of my only bits of knowledge about HIV, is that it was, a death sentence. And that was kind of how I came into my diagnosis. And that's all I really knew. I didn't know about treatment, about, people being able to live long, healthy lives. So I kind of really worked to learn about HIV. I was reading so much and talking to friends, talking to doctors, just to learn as much as I could. And, I kind of eventually, learned all the facts and all the truth, that HIV isn't a death sentence and you can live, kind of a long, healthy life. And yeah, a couple of years ago, so back in 2020, I went through a bit of a challenging breakup, and I'd never really kind of talked, publicly about my HIV status, and that kind of trauma of going through that breakup really made me come out of my shell quite a lot, and that was when I started to talk more publicly. Did a few videos, which I posted online, and got quite a good reaction from a lot of my friends and people that didn't know about my status. And, from that, I kind of just picked up from there, and, I posted more and more videos and pictures and things, and just talked a lot more about HIV, in my own community, with friends, with colleagues. And, through that, a lot of people started to reach out to me and talk to me about, their own experiences, their own diagnosis. So I've been kind of talking to people, that are going through the same thing that I did, and really just kind of helping to, provide some education, a bit of bit more understanding about what living with HIV is actually like.
Yeah, what do you think it was about that sort of traumatic breakup that made you go, this is the moment that I'm going to kind of embrace it, I guess, and talk about it? What do you think that was?
I think it's difficult to kind of put into words. I was just in a very kind of dark place when I kind of went through the breakup. And when I finally kind of started to see the light, so to speak, I'd always kind of wanted to give something back, to a community that given me so much support and love. And I think just kind of going through that dark time and kind of coming out the other end of it, I just really wanted to do something and give something back. So I started kind of talking more publicly and volunteering with a local charity as well.
I'm glad you do. And, you're very vocal, obviously, about your HIV status on your social media. A topic that comes up and has come up is suicide. And that is a topic that I think makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. I'm a little different. I kind of talk about it quite freely, having lost very close personal friends to suicide. I have maybe a bit more of a controversial take on it, but tell me why it's important for you to discuss sort of suicide as you have, and your relationship with it, and how that relates to HIV, and why you think it's important to have those conversations so openly.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to talk about mental health in general as well. I think, a HIV diagnosis does come with, a bit of a challenge to your mental health. I think, my personal experience when I got diagnosed was I was in that place and I was feeling quite suicidal. And I remember sitting on the beach down here in Brighton and was kind of like, well, I can't deal with this. I'm just going to kind of throw myself in the water and that'll be it. But it's really, it's mental health is under the stigma, and likewise with HIV and suicide as well. I think it's really important that people know that they can talk about it, they can be open about it, their experiences, what they're going through, hopefully that'll kind of lead people to, look for some support or help, or just kind of, just get that off, out of their heads, out of their minds to talk about it.
Yeah, because as you rightly point out, an HIV diagnosis, whether it was last week, last month, 10 years ago for you, 15 years ago in my case, or even further back, is an incredibly traumatic thing to hear. And I think that's largely because of the stigma, right? And the out-of-date information. Yeah. If everyone knew what you and I know and what the doctors know, like U equals U and all of that, do you think it would still be as much of a traumatic diagnosis for people?
I want to say no. I think it might be, kind of work towards being a less traumatic experience, but I think there's always going to be some trauma there. I think, as much as I want stigma to be completely eradicated, I don't think it ever will. I think there'll always be some challenge around it. So I think people will kind of come into a diagnosis, almost thinking the worst. But the more that we can educate people, maybe that'll kind of just lessen that impact a little bit.
How do you put yourself in a position now where you can help others who are newly diagnosed?
That's a good question. I think, the fact that I kind of understand a lot more about it and the sort of challenges that come with it. And, likewise, just being in a kind of a much better, mental position to kind of, obviously have my days, but, I'm kind of more well equipped with the tools and the techniques to deal with that. I've had training through work of being a mental health first aider, and that's been a massive help to kind of understand a bit more about how to support people and signpost people in the right direction. But generally, just being in a kind of much better control of my own mental health and physical and sexual health just puts me in a much better place to be able to kind of speak to people. And as much as kind of sometimes talking about my own experiences can be a bit of a traumatic event, and kind of bring up those kind of old feelings, kind of knowing what I do now and having been through that, I feel like in a much stronger place to be able to support people, talk them through the reality of it.
So look, everyone's journey is different, but what are your initial advice if someone is newly diagnosed? What would you say to that person? And again, everyone's journey is different, everyone's circumstances are different, but what are a couple of sort of key takeaways that you've learned over the past 11 years that you think would be really helpful for somebody in that newly diagnosed position to hear?
I think firstly, it's just to kind of take your time. It's a big piece of news. Just kind of take your time and understand it as much as you can. Read about the reality. Read online and read when I got diagnosed, I got given like this massive bag of books to read. So I kind of read through all that, and that kind of gave me all the knowledge and understanding that I needed to start kind of moving forwards. I think speaking to people is super important. I think it's really important to be able to speak to close people, family, friends, people that you're confident in speaking to, and just kind of sharing that your experiences and kind of how you're feeling. And likewise, social media is massive for a lot of advocates online. So I think that's also a good place to kind of start to look as well.
Yeah, well, we're grateful that there are people like you, Matt Webster, out there that newly diagnosed people can slide into your DMs and reach out to you because the lived experience is really helpful. And sometimes the anonymous nature of it, the fact that we don't know each other, sometimes actually makes it, I think, easier to share these stories with someone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think when I spoke to a friend of mine, quite close to being diagnosed, I was really scared to actually talk to this person because I knew him. He was, friends of my ex, and it was quite scary to kind of, start saying these things, even though he was, positive as well. I think it was still quite challenging. So being able to speak to someone who, is in an anonymous way does help a lot. And there's obviously a lot of charities out there that can, provide the same experience as well.
Yeah, well, Matt Webster, good talking to you. We'll put all your social media information up when in the post below so that people can see this. And if they want, they can slide into your DMs. And that's why we here at Plus Life exist as well. Matt, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Carl. It's great being on.
Absolutely. That's going to do it for this episode of Plus Talk. If you want more information about us or Matt, check out our website, pluslifemedia.com. And remember, you can follow us across social media platforms. We are at @PlusLifeMedia. Until next time, be nice, smile, wash your hands, and all the usual stuff. See you next time.